Good morning, scholars. Welcome back to another day of history with Mr. Amador. We're going to go ahead and continue talking about the events that are going to uh, pull the nation apart, especially between North and South. Yesterday, we talked about the Compromise of 1820 and kind of how this whole ordeal with adding more slave and free states disrupted the balance that they had before, where there was an equal amount of slave and free states. The reason why this was really important is Southerners were angry and scared that if Northerners had more representation in Congress with more free states, that they'd be able to end slavery. And then people in the North were worried that if there were more slave states and free states, that slavery would continue to spread west with manifest destiny. So they come up with this compromise known as the Missouri Compromise, where they're going to let Missouri be a slave state, but they're going to create Maine as a free state from Massachusetts. And they're also going to draw this invisible line at the 3630 parallel that says nothing above this line can allow slavery. And then we saw how that kind of broke down and how that compromise didn't really work out. So we're going to go ahead and continue now. 30 years later, we're now going to have another issue that's going to cause for another compromise known as the Compromise of 1850. All right, let's go ahead and get started. On January 21st, 1850, Henry Clay, now a senator from Kentucky, trudged through a Washington snowstorm to pay a call on Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, the creator of Clay, the creator of the Missouri Compromise. So 30 years ago, he created the Missouri Compromise. He's also known as the Great Compromiser. He had a new plan to end the deadlock over California, but he needed Webster's support to get his plan through Congress. So California wanted to join as a free state, and we know that a lot of people are like, well, wait a minute, part of California is underneath that 3630 parallel, so they should be able to allow slavery. But the people in California did not want slavery there. Okay, let's keep going. But in order for Clay to get his plan passed, he needed Daniel Webster's support in Congress. So Clay's new compromise had something to please just about everyone. It began by admitting California to the Union, that means the United States, as a free state, which would please the North. Meanwhile, it allowed the New Mexico and Utah territories to decide whether to allow slavery, which would please the South. In addition, Clay's plan ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Although slaveholders in Washington would be able to keep their slaves, human beings would no longer be bought and sold there. Clay and Webster agreed that this compromise would win support from abolitionists without threatening the rights of slaveholders. So finally, Clay's plan called for passage of a strong fugitive slave law. Slaveholders had long wanted such a law, which would make it easier to find and reclaim runaway slaves. So Henry Clay, the Great Compromiser, is going to call up his friend Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, right? One's from the South, one's from the North. And he's going to come up with this Compromise of 1850. And Henry Clay is known as the Great Compromiser. And he says, okay, let's make the North happy by letting California become a free state. Let's make the South happy by letting New Mexico and Utah decide if they want to allow slavery. So that makes the North happy and makes the South happy. And then to make the North even more happy, we're going to get rid of the slave trade in D.C., meaning in the nation's capital, you cannot buy or sell slaves. And then to make it even and make the South happy, they're going to pass a Fugitive Slave Act, which says that slaveholders can go and get their slaves back that ran away to the North. So, Compromise of 1850, as you can see, is a lot better than the Compromise of 1820 in terms of making people a little bit more happy. But let's go ahead. We're going to keep reading about this Compromise of 1850 and see if it holds up. All right, the compromise is accepted. Hoping that Clay's compromise would end the crisis, Webster agreed to help it get passed in Congress. However, despite Webster's support, Congress debated the Compromise of 1850 for 9 frustrating months. So almost a year they debated about this. It almost became the Compromise of 1851. As tempers frayed, Southerners talked of simply leaving the Union peacefully, which means just like leaving the United States without war. And Webster dismissed such talk as foolish. Peaceable secession, he exclaimed. Your eyes and mine are never destined to see that miracle. I see it as plainly as I see the sun in heaven. I see that secession must produce such a war I will not describe. So Daniel Webster is like, yeah, the South, when it says, oh, we'll just succeed and we'll just leave the United States and there'll be no bloodshed. He knows that that is not what's going to happen. It is going to be plain as seeing the sun in the sky, which is a lot of people are going to die. All right. A war over slavery was something few Americans wanted to face. In September 1850, Congress finally adopted Clay's plan. Although most Americans were happy to see the crisis ended, some Southerners remained wary of the compromise. Moreover, the compromise led to the demise of one of the country's main political parties, the Whig Party, Clay and Webster's party, because members had moral objections to slavery. So a lot of people in the Whig Party opposed slavery and didn't like that this Compromise of 1850 was still allowing slavery to exist. All right, so again, a compromise is when two people or groups of people or parties give up something that they want to please the other, right? So in compromises, you're not going to get everything you want, but you have to do with the best. So right here, as we look at our key, we see free states and free territories are going to be in green. Slave states are going to be in purple. And slave territories are going to be kind of like in this light pink area. And we can see that they opened up the New Mexico territory and the Utah territory to allow the people who live here to vote for slavery. Now we can see the 36th parallel line is right here. This is that 3630 from the Missouri Compromise that said nothing above it would allow slavery. But as we can see, they're going to get rid of that with the Compromise of 1850 because the Utah territory is above that 3630 parallel, but is allowed to have slavery. So the Compromise of 1850 is going to replace the Compromise of 1820, that Missouri Compromise. So let's go ahead and continue. So as of right now, the only other places that could get slavery are these areas. All of this area in green is banned from slavery, according to the Compromise of 1850. All right, so the Compromise of 1850 is going to fail. It's going to last like a couple years, but then by like 1854, it's just going to collapse. So let's go ahead and find out what causes it to collapse. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster hoped the Compromise of 1850 would quiet the slavery controversy for years to come. In fact, it satisfied almost no one, and the debate grew louder each year. Let's start with the Fugitive Slave Act. People in the North and South were unhappy with the Fugitive Slave Act, though for different reasons. Northerners did not want to enforce the act, whereas Southerners felt the act did not do enough to ensure, that means make sure, that the return of their escaped property. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, a person arrested as a runaway slave had almost no legal rights. Many runaways fled all the way to Canada rather than risk being caught and sent back to their owners. So, if slaves went to Canada, the Fugitive Slave Act could not be used there because it's a different country. So if you're in Canada, you cannot be brought back into the United States. Let's keep going. Others decided to stand and fight. Reverend Jermaine Logan, a former slave living in New York, said boldly, "I don't respect this law. I don't fear it. I won't obey it. I will not live as a slave, and if force is employed to re-enslave me, I shall make preparations to meet that crisis as becomes a man." Saying, like, I will fight, I will kill, I'm not going back to becoming a slave. So, the Fugitive Slave Act also said that any person who helped a slave escape or even refused to help slave catchers could be thrown in jail. And this provision, people complain, would force many Northerners to become slave catchers, which we know that the North was not going to be doing that. So, opposition to the act was widespread in the North. People in the North do not like this fugitive slave law, and when slave catchers came to Boston, they were hounded by crowds of angry citizens shouting, "Slave hunters! There go the slave hunters!" After a few days of this treatment, most slave catchers decided to leave. So Northerners' refusal to support the act made slaveholders very angry, and it also made enforcing this act impossible. One of the tens of thousands of fugitives living in the North during the 1850s, only about 300 were captured and returned to their owners. So out of like 30 to 40,000 runaway slaves living in the North, only 300 of them are going to be captured and brought back. And here you can see like a sign, right, where the people of Boston are warning the colored people of Boston that there are going to be kidnappers and slave catchers, right? So make sure that you keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open, right? We see April 24th, 1851. So right here it says, like, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. So, because they have to become kidnappers and slave catchers, they have to try to enforce this law. So pretty, it's great reading these primary sources so we can see what's going on, kind of like this one right here. All right, so after the Fugitive Slave Act passes, this woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is going to write this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that is going to shake the country. It is going to be, again, one of those books like Common Sense, which is going to completely affect the course of American history. Let's go ahead and read. Nothing brought the horrors of slavery home to Northerners more than Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The novel grew out of a vision Stowe had while sitting in church on a wintry Sunday morning in 1851. The vision began with a saintly slave known as Uncle Tom and his cruel master, Simon Legree, who, in a furious rage, had the old slave whipped to death. Just before Uncle Tom's soul slipped out of his body, he opened his eyes and whispered to Legree, "Ye poor miserable critter, there ain't no more you can do. I forgive you with all my soul." Racing home, Stowe scribbled down what she had imagined. Her vision of Uncle Tom's death became part of a much longer story that was first published in installments in an abolitionist newspaper. In one issue, readers held their breath as the slave Eliza chose to risk death rather than be sold away from her young son. Chased by slave hunters and their dogs, Eliza dashed to freedom across the ice-choked Ohio River, clutching her child in her arms. In a later issue, Stowe's readers wept as they read her account of how the character of Uncle Tom died at the hands of Simon Legree. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published as a novel. Plays based on the book toured the country, thrilling audiences with Eliza's dramatic escape to freedom. No other work have ever aroused such powerful emotions about slavery. In the South, the novel and its author were scorned and cursed. I mean, they did not like her and they thought she was spreading lies. However, in the North, Uncle Tom's Cabin made millions of people even angrier about the cruelties of slavery. So, this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is going to get people in the North who maybe are not so much against slavery, and those who are already against slavery, even more against slavery. While in the South, it's going to make people in the South very angry because they think that this book is filled with lies and paints a unrealistic picture of slavery and life in the South. So, books change history. All right, y'all. You guys are going to go ahead and I know this says complete the questions on the next slide, but you guys are actually going to complete the questions in Google Classroom. I'm going to go ahead and put that in here right now. So go ahead and head on over to Google Classroom. You're going to have about 5 minutes to complete this cycle. Once you're done, you can put your Chromebooks at half-mast or type done in the chat. I will see y'all back here on Monday as we're going to get into Dred Scott and some of the other events that lead up to the Civil War. See y'all then.